Good morning all, and thank you for joining us for the webinar on the new drivers of learning agenda in partnership with Pluralsight. I'm Ritu from People Matters, and before telling you about today's agenda, let me give you a brief about today's webinar topic. Learning leaders are amidst of one of the most fascinating times in this profession. The contemporary dynamic business environment is forcing organizations to infuse more learning to keep their talent current and to help their business remain agile. The shift in business models and technology is forcing shifts in content requirements and curriculum. The shift in demographics is bringing innovation in channels of learning delivery, bringing e-learning in onboarding, accompanied with other SMIC technologies. Also, there is internal pressure to scale capability consistently with shrinking budget. We will be discussing the following key pointers in today's session. What are the expectations from L&D function in today's business scenario? How does L&D shape an employee's development journey through learning agenda? What are the new methods of learning, creating learning culture in an organization? And what is SMAC and its role in supporting organizations in their journey to adopt new business and generational requirements? We have the privilege of having with us Arun Rajamani, Country Head and General Manager at Pluralsight India. Arun is an IT industry veteran, having managed large business in India and Asia Pacific. Since April 2015, he has been spreading the country operations of Pluralsight India, with an objective of making Pluralsight a synonymous brand with technology, learning, and to positively impact the lives of over 2 million developers in India. Another speaker for today's webinar session is Esther Martin. Esther is Editor-in-Chief and CEO of People Matters Media. She's an HR professional turned entrepreneur and alumnus from ISD in Hyderabad. She founded People Matters 6 years back. A partner for today's webinar is Pluralsight. Pluralsight was founded in 2004, is a global leader in online learning for professional software developers, IT specialists, and creative technologists. As the world's largest curated professional development platform, the company offers instant access to more than 4,000 courses authored by top experts. With customers in more than 150 countries, Pluralsight serves as a career catalyst, delivering hands-on practical training for most in-demand and understaffed jobs of today. We have saved for you to ask questions at the end of the webinar session. For those who are watching the live session, you can submit your questions anytime during the presentation through the Q&A section. We will try to respond as many questions as time allows. We have a full exciting agenda for today's session. So without any further delay, I'm inviting Esther to take it over. Over to you, Esther.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ritu, and a very good morning to all our listeners. It's a privilege to be hosting all of you today. As Ritu was telling us, the objective really we have for this morning together, we have around 45 minutes to 1 hour together as a group. And the objective we had was first is to really kind of focus on what's the expectation of the L&D function. And I will take you through some of the research we had done a couple of years ago on the role of the CLO in particular. The second objective is really about how the L&D is shaping the new learning agenda and specifically how technology is helping the learning leaders to do that. And Arun Rajamani will cover that in a lot of detail because I think Pluralsight not only is a leader in the space of learning, but as well there's a lot of data and research that they've also been bringing together, and he'll be sharing that. So I want to also give the opportunity to again remind you to please keep sharing questions throughout the two presentations, and we'll be able to take them at the end. Before I start, I want to thank Arun Rajamani and the Pluralsight team for supporting us putting this content together, and hopefully it will help you answer some of the dilemmas that you have as learning leaders, and hopefully you'll be able to bring back some of the learnings back to your role after we finish this webinar. So I want to take you through three dimensions before I start and share the key findings of our research. The first dimension is really, if I look at the HR three generations discipline in itself. The first generation of HR was a very process-oriented, really focusing on systems and building those processes and systems for managing people. So I think that was the first generation, and some organizations are still in that generation, especially in industries that are not so people-intensive. The second generation of HR, really what we saw was a lot more focus, and that's probably the generation we are today, a lot more focus on capability and people development as part of the mandate of HR. And what we started to see is the third generation of HR, which actually brings both together. Not only being able to focus on building processes and systems, but really aligning simultaneously the requirement of capability and people development as part of the HR mandate. The reason why I contextualize that, taking a step back to HR, is because if you really see, the research shows that India specifically is one of the countries where it's more difficult. The talent shortage is most acute, and I'm referring to the Manpower group research that actually looks at India's third position globally in terms of talent shortage. So if we move now to a little bit the role of the CLO, in specifically, learning and development has really gone through a tremendous transformation. I think the need of the hour for organizations to remain agile is to be able to really cater to the needs of the skills required not only for today but also for the future. So I'll take you through some of the findings of our study. The first, just contextualize that this is a study we had done for the community along with Right Management. That happened a couple of years ago. We interviewed 83 CEOs and CHROs and CLOs to bring together what is the state of the CHRO. Just hold on for a minute. Yeah, okay, great. So let me take you to the key findings of it. There'll be 5 findings. One, I will cover the role of the CLO per se, and how many organizations actually have a CLO, and how many of those organizations, how long they've had a CLO role. The second element I will cover will be the mandate of the CLO. Those organizations that have a CLO, what is actually their main goal and expectation from business. The third element we will cover will be the reporting in terms of what's the structure of today's organizations and where does the CLO actually fits in that structure. The fourth element will be the budget, which I think is very, very critical for all of you who have joined the webinar, because eventually we do have a constraint always in budget. So we'll cover about where is that budget going and how is that evolving. And the fifth piece will be what is the right kind of profile to be the CLO and the learning leader from the organization. Yeah. So let me take you through the first piece. Yeah. The first piece on which organizations have a CLO. So if you see, for example, you can see it in your slide, 56% of organizations do not have a CLO as per, really named as a CLO, even though they are doing it in bits and pieces. So of course they have a person who's probably leading the talent management piece. There's also probably somebody who's managing and leading the organizational development, learning and training, capability building. So all these roles are happening in bits and pieces. But it's interesting to see that 56% of companies actually do not have a designated chief learning officer per se. It's also interesting to note how old is this role been. So majority of the organizations, you see, is less than 5 years old. That actually shows the need of the hour and the evolution of that role only in the very recent years. Align that to the point that I was telling you in the beginning of the evolution of the HR function per se. Now, what we can see is that there is a need to actually have an aggregator of these roles for the organization to be able to add a lot more value and aligning to the business, which takes me to the next learning, which is the mandate of the role of the CLO. Now, here, before we get into the detail about each one of the what we ask the respondents about what is it actually what the role of the CLO is doing, we ask 2 questions. One is what is it what the CLO is supposed to do? And the second question we ask is what are the top reasons for you to decide to have a CLO, right? So let's look at the first part first. When we ask about what is the mandate, the key responsibility of the CLO was about building the capability of the business. So if you can see here, it's about the business strategy and what the organization is trying to achieve, and hence we have the capabilities to be able to do that today and also for the future. So the top three reasons, or the top three mandates actually, for the CLO role was aligning learning to business strategy. Very close to it is actually closing the competency gaps. And finally is aligning all that with a talent management strategy. So leaders are really unanimous on their opinion that the CLO top priority is really integrating the learning agenda with a business strategy. Now, if you look at the role about why did you decide as an organization to create a CLO role, the top reason was scale. That was the number one reason, very closely followed by business transformation and the need for innovation. So these are organizations that have identified very early that for them to be able to scale, for them to be able to transform, for them to be able to innovate, there has to be a particular function which is strategically looking at learning, and not only as an operational or an administrative function, but really as a strategic partner to the business. Now, when we ask the question for those who don't have a role, are you looking at creating a role in the next 3 years? It's interesting to see that 26% are saying yes, but not short term, maybe later. And only 17% said yes, we are looking at creating a role, which I found, when we were discussing it together as a team, we realized that it's interesting that organizations are realizing of the need, but they're probably not yet to that level of maturity to say, I actually need a CLO role to be able to take that. Now, the next piece which we're going to cover is both the reporting structure and also the where does that fit really in the organization. So while the role of the CLO is closely linked to business, what we realized in the study is that most of the CLOs report to the CHRO and not really to the business head. So if you see 51% current today reports to the CHRO, and only 10% reports to a business head, or 12% if you were to actually take CEO, business heads, and COOs. And when we ask where should that role actually report to, people agree to say it should actually be staying with the CHRO. But many more people actually agreed that 38%, if you were to see, is both CEOs, business heads, and COOs. Right? So in terms of reporting, I think there's a bit of a divided point of view about where should this function be reporting to, and I think probably it depends on the nature of the business. And probably I'll address one of those questions maybe to Arun as we close the webinar. But eventually, it's about how important that is to business, maybe for a IT or a product organization, maybe more so, and how important is for that learning piece to be linked to talent management, and probably that comes more under the umbrella of the CHRO. So we move to the fourth point, and I have 2 more points to cover. I'm also conscious about time. The fourth element was about budget. Learning budgets are always, under tremendous pressure. In today's scenario, we see the reporting piece are mostly controlled by the HR and not by the business, even though we have seen a trend of more of those budgets to actually be residing as a budget to be used by the project manager or the project lead. But still today, when we've seen the reporting, we see that the budgets still are controlled mostly by the HR. And most leaders believe that it's better for the CLO or the CHRO to hold and control those learning budgets more than the head of business. So I'll take you through the allocation of who's spending those learning budgets. You see 49% of the respondents says that budget is spent by the CHRO. Vis-a-vis 28% that says that's actually controlled and decided, the spend is allocated and decided by the CEO or the business head. Now, when we ask the question about who should actually be holding it, it's interesting to see that many more are saying that the CLO should take a lot more accountability and a lot more independence to be able to take those decisions, which was not there in what's happening today, really. The fifth element, and I think it's interesting for many of you who are aspiring learning leaders as well, and for some of you who are already CLOs, but it's probably a succession or career for your colleagues, is who is the CLO? Which role does he or she comes from? What is the kind of skills that they have? Where is really, the expectation from the business coming from? So most of the organizations that we survey that had a CLO role for less than 5 years, we ask them. It's also interesting to see what the experience that's required to be a good CLO. So the data shows us the first piece, and no surprises there. Business acumen is the number one competency, or I may say experience, for a CLO to be able to fulfill the role. And there's no surprise there, because if you remember, the first number one mandate was about aligning business strategy and business execution, learning strategy. So unless business acumen is a very, very strong component of the CLO role, clearly that would be a very difficult thing for a professional to do so. The second thing that follows, and again, no surprise there, is the culture building. We have seen repeatedly how learning is linked to engagement, and I think Arun will cover a little bit that as well, and how learning is not only about capability, but is also about culture building. So for CLOs to be able to have experience and competency to be able to link their learning strategy with culture building was the second piece, and then followed again with people relations. At the end of the day, the CLO role is a role of influencer, is a role of a change agent. So 65% of our respondents says that people relations is a very important component to become a great CLO. Now, in terms of the expectations, very linked to the mandate, business gap identification is the number one expectation, short term, followed by mapping business with talent goals. Kind of like really the operational short term expectation from the function. In terms of the long term expectation, little bit of a divide there, because I think we were looking for a lot more of alignment with the mandate, but what we got is the number one is about aligning the process of learning, which is probably the piece about aligning learning with talent management and the overall strategy piece. 37% says creating systems to be able to scale, and that's systems relate to not only the traditional methods of learning, but integrating more technology and integrating more new age methodologies for learning. Building a always ready workforce was followed by 31%. And when we ask that, also we ask what learning really means to you. So learning for the respondents was 46% is of technical capabilities. Technical meaning not only the technology piece but also the functional piece, followed by leadership and managerial capabilities as a second point. So this brings me to the end. You can actually reach out to our website for the complete report. I wanted to kind of spend 15 minutes to take you through the key 5 findings. And I think while the role of the CLO is still very evolutionary, especially in India, leaders are really telling us, when we spoke to them also for the empirical one-to-ones, that the importance of the role is only going to increase. I think the learning function will be expected to partner with business to be able to take the organization, whether it's scale or transformation or innovation. And I think the emergence of the CLO role as somebody who's increasing the power of the organizational decision-making to implement business strategy will continue to increase. Even so more, I think today, considering that many leaders are very, very clear that talent is the number one area in their agenda to be able to enable that implementation. So that brings me to the end. I'll be happy to take some questions at the end after Arun's presentation. I have the privilege to welcome now Arun Rajmani. He's the country head and general manager of Pluralsight, who's going to take us through really what's changing in the learning agenda, what's happening in the different methodologies, and also share some of the research piece that they've done. And how can we really look at SMAC in supporting our learning strategy and help us to innovate. So over to you, Arun. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Esther. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to partner with People Matters. And to all the listeners on the webinar, a warm welcome. And thank you for staying on the call today to listen to the new drivers of the learning agenda, which is the topic for today. So over the next 30 minutes, the way what I intend to cover are a couple of key points. Esther talked about the aspects related to why skill development is going to be so important to us in the industry and for us as a country. Just taking that discussion forward, I'd like to cover how is it that the industry looks at learning today, and what are the issues that the industry is facing, and what should the industry really do to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented in front of it, and to leapfrog from a skills perspective to the next level. So that's really going to be the topics that we would cover over the next 30 minutes. So as we transition the slides, I'd like to start off the discussions with a quote from Jack Welch. And he made this over a decade ago, and I think it's still so relevant to the way we look at an organization's agility. So what he indicated was the ability of an organization to learn and translate that learning into action would be the ultimate competitive advantage. And I think that's so true today. And we look at organization after organization that has actually taken advantage of its assets, which are people, and the learning that the people have had, and translate that into strategies. Those organizations have been very, very successful. Closer home, this article appeared probably a year ago when Ravi Venkatesan, who's on the board of Infosys and also the chairman of Bank of Baroda today, he made a very, very ominous statement to say that the IT party is actually over now. And what he actually meant by saying that the IT party was over was that the existing models that the IT industry was used to, which was time and material, cost arbitrage, was no longer going to work. The whole industry has shifted from being cost-focused to quality-focused to outcome-focused. Today, clients of our IT industry companies are expecting better models of partnership. They're expecting more skin in the game. They're expecting to look at models which actually would pay off on the outcomes that they generate. And what it means to the organizations today is that they can't put more people onto a problem and hope to solve it. They have to put better quality people, they have to focus on better outcomes, and they have to focus on quality. All that is going to need better quality of people to support these initiatives. So that's really what he meant by saying IT industry party is over. Now also let's look at an indication as to why he made that statement. Now, this is a map that's interesting for all of you to look at, that talks about the technologies that have emerged over the years. So from 1995 until 2016, you see the number of new products and technologies that have emerged, which people need to be aware of, starting from JavaScript, moving on to .NET, C#, and all the way to looking at technologies such as Tableau, which are really the in thing today. What it means is that professionals who learn technologies have to be very, very, very and agile of what are the new skills that are going to impact the industry and how do they stay focused on learning those new skills. So we call this syndrome a 2-year half-life syndrome. It actually means that a technology professional would lose skills, or the skills that a technology professional has today would become obsolete every 2 years. So half of the skills that the professional has becomes obsolete every 2 years. So that's called the technology 2-year half-life syndrome. And what it means is organizations need to look at the half-life syndrome and look at areas that they need to constantly update skills amongst their employees and make the organization not just a learning organization, but an organization that's current with what their customers want from a perspective of technology deployment and adoption. The other change that we are also seeing in the industry today is digital. Irrespective of which industry you belong to, if you're on the call, manufacturing, banking, financial services, or the IT industry, digital is one disruptive technology that's come in, that's going to stay, and that's also going to disrupt the way technology adoption is going to happen. And this is a quote that came from C.P. Gurnani, who is the vice chairman of NASSCOM, who basically mentioned that it's going to reshape the industry, and the potential of the industry is yet to be realized. And he also went on to say that today, most people have a different view of what digital means. So every organization that we talk to comes back with a very different definition of digital. For some, digital is all about digital marketing. For others, digital is about the user experience that they provide to their clients and their consumers. For others, it's about the process transformation that they do. And for still some others, it's about actually changing the entire infrastructure that exists into a more digital infrastructure. Now, irrespective of which part of digital that people could look at, the crux of the matter is that digital as a technology and as a priority is going to reshape the entire industry and how people need to be adopting and learning digital skills so that they can be better prepared to deploy those skills with customers. And why does the industry need to focus on digital? Right? This chart talks about the opportunities that digital presents to the industry, more so for India. So NASSCOM study says that conventional technologies would grow at just 2x from what it is over the next 3 to 5 years. So at 2025, it's expected to grow 2x. But if you look at digital skills, it's almost expected to grow about 4x or 4 times the current size. Not only is it growing faster, but it's also providing for better profitability. So people with digital skills command better, billing rates. Organizations with better digital skills are able to get better projects, and they are able to make much more profits from the execution and the engagement that they have with their clients. So therefore, digital is becoming a very, very critical element of how organizations look at the portfolio of technology strategies that they need to look at. Now, Esther talked about SMAC, right? Now, from a perspective of SMAC as a platform, that's wholly subsumed into what digital would have. Now, is that sufficient for us to look at digital? Perhaps not. Maybe there are more elements that we need to look over and above what SMAC would constitute as digital for us. So net-net, given what the industry experts are saying, given what some of our role models like Jack Welch and Ravi Venkatesan are saying, the summary is that the IT industry and the entire industry at large is at crossroads. The crossroads are around what is the path to adopt for the future that's going to sustain how technology professionals can actually perform better, and how the organizations can be more agile in terms of delivering better quality of solutions to their clients. So these crossroads are going to determine how organizations look at their learning agenda. And let's take a moment to see how do organizations actually do it today. So what are the drivers and triggers for skill development? So, we commissioned a survey and spoke to over 100, organizations, and we covered, CLOs, we covered, business delivery folks, we covered some of, the technology professionals themselves, and to look at how they look at the triggers for skill development. So as we talk to people, just over 46% of the people came back and said that they were looking at proactive strategies for skill development, which means that, as an example, if they saw digital as an opportunity, they would actually have a strategy to look at, skilling their people to take advantage of the digital skills that were going to come up in the future. So proactive skill development was just 46%. Over 35% of the people came back and said that they are driven by what their clients ask them to do. So the clients came back and said that they needed 25 people on Python. They would go and find, training opportunities and identify 35, people who could actually go back and get themselves trained on Python so that they could be billable for their clients. So ad hoc, client needs determined how they looked at the skill development. And over 10% of the people came back and said that training the bench strength was the biggest strategy that they looked at, which actually meant that people who were on the job, they weren't focused on doing any skill development for them, but people who were between projects, those were the people that were the target audience for these organizations to be looking at skill development. So obviously looking at a very wide spectrum of organizations from proactive to extremely reactive in terms of the way they look at skill development. As we spoke to them and asked them questions as to what would they look at the biggest factors for consideration in skill development, over 90% of them came back and said that content quality was the first area of consideration for them. They looked at the content quality. The next thing that they looked at was assessments and certifications, which means that if people got trained, they also needed to be certified so that they could go back and tell the world that we have so many certified people on new technologies that were there. The third area in order of merit that they looked at was content relevance. So content quality, certifications, and content relevance was the three biggest areas that they looked at from a value proposition of skill development. It was not about aligning back to the strategy of the company. It was not to go back and say that they were trying to build a talent pool that could take advantage of what was going to be available in the future. But most people who looked at answering the survey came back and very tactically looked at content quality, certifications, and the relevance of content alone as the triggers or the value proposition that they would look at from a training provider or from the strategy they adopted for skill development. So the next question that we asked them was, if they had an opportunity to invest, where would they look at investing time and effort to go back and skill their people. And the outcome was quite startling. Technologies, if you look at this graph here, and you looked at the vertical axis, which actually talks about the relative maturity of technologies, and you looked at the horizontal axis, which actually talks about the focus that the learning and development teams have for skill development, most of the investment of time was actually going into technologies that are fairly mature, which is Java, .NET, enterprise applications like SAP and so on, or for testing. Now, if you look at the extreme right-hand corner on the top, which actually talks about technologies such as digitalization, technologies such as big data and analytics, or social, or IoT, which actually constitutes, SMAC and part of the digital components, which were long-term in nature, there was very little focus that was actually being put by the learning organizations on skilling people within any company, which actually talked about the fact that people were not investing for the future, they were actually investing for the present and doing more to keep the lights on. Now, there's no right or wrong in the strategy. It basically depends on an organization's ability to keep the building on and to make sure that what the customers are asking for right now is delivered versus looking at what you could do to build an organization for the future. And that's a classical dilemma that anybody in the learning organization or anybody in the business today faces. And through the course of the presentation, we'll talk about a few areas that should be considered to look at addressing this dilemma, which is today a real world problem. Now, the question that we asked them again was to say, if you're spending money doing most of the training in technologies which are more mature, and you're spending very little time and effort to actually train technologies on technologies for the future, how effectively do you see this ROI? And they came back again revealing results which we're sharing here. So on an average globally, an organization spends about $1,800 on direct and indirect costs associated with training. Knowing fully well that 80% of the learning today happens on the job. It's not, learning doesn't happen in a classroom environment alone, learning happens mostly on the job. So organizations basically are spending $1,800 for 20% of the time that people spend in a classroom or in a training environment. And when we ask them, how many of them actually feel that they have created an organization where capabilities are no longer an issue, and over 70% of them came back and said that they see capability gaps as the biggest problem, which means just less than 30% of the organizations actually felt that spending that $1,800 on 20% of the time that people spend in a classroom or a learning environment was actually good for them, and they've been able to address the capability gaps that they've had. So what does this tell you? This tells you that most organizations are spending a lot of money in a very ineffective training model and continue to have the same challenges associated with capabilities of people within their organization. So this is something that we need to keep in perspective as to how do we really look at skilling. So just to summarize, people are spending more money in known and mature technologies instead of investing in technologies for the future. The money that they're spending in training is largely being ineffective because it's not addressing the core problem of building a learning organization and building a talent pool within the organization. So how exactly should we go about doing that? And before we do that, let's look at some India data. What we shared with you today was data that was global in nature, but in India, the situation is even more acute. As against $1,800 that global organizations spend, in India, organizations spend less than 13,700 rupees, which translates to about a $200 equivalent in today's conversion rates. So against $1,800, Indian organizations are spending $200 on skilling. Now, assuming that we have trainers who are available at low cost, it still is an issue that $200 compared to $1,800, which is 9 times the cost that we spend here in India, how adequate is that really? So what it means is that the costs that are being spent here are contributing to an average of 31 hours of learning per employee per year, as against a global average of about 80 hours per employee per year. So not only are the number of hours that an employee puts into learning is lower in India, but also the costs are dramatically lower in terms of how much organizations spent on learning. So indirectly, what it's going to lead to is that there is lesser opportunity for people to learn, and there is lesser effectiveness of learning that's being translated by the organizations as far as their programs are concerned. The other challenge that most organizations have today is that conventional models of learning are probably also not addressing the different learning styles that people have. Today, if you look at it, any person in any organization has a different learning style. There are people whose learning styles varies from being very, very focused and diligent to the other extreme where people are focusing on just-in-time learning. So let's take some examples, right? For those of us who actually manage teams and who've actually had a lot of people working for us, we do know that in our teams we have people, once an assignment is given for learning or once a recommendation has been provided for learning, these are the people who will go into the courses that have been prescribed. These are the people who go into the learning material that has been assigned to them, and they do a very diligent job of learning. They would read everything from the front cover to the back cover. They would complete all the exercises. They would complete all the assignments that have been given to them. And these guys are the ideal learners that we have. On the other hand, we have people who are super sharp and probably representing the millennials of today, who do not like to do very structured learning. They like to learn just in time. If they have a problem that they're facing in their job, they'd like to find a solution for that, either by talking to people or by referencing material that gives them the exact solution to their problem. And they just learn that and they go back and apply it on the job. Now, in between, you have people who have different styles again. There are people who need to have more opportunities to learn because in the first time they don't understand it. They have to repeatedly learn. And you also have people who are very distracted learners who go back and do multiple things during learning, but they come back eventually to finish whatever has been assigned. Now, imagine that our conventional forms of learning, be it classroom or be it prescriptive forms of learning, how does that really take into account of the learning styles that people have and address that requirement to make the learning more effective? Which obviously is a case in point for us to consider as a community to say, are we doing the right thing by adopting what we've been doing in terms of either spending lesser money or by adopting models that have been proven over a period of time but is not as effective as you would like it to be. So given all of this, this is a summary of what we've seen in the country. As we've engaged with several organizations, from large enterprise organizations to the smaller organizations, what we've seen is a majority of the organizations today still continue to believe that instructor-led training and the conventional forms of learning are the best for them and for their employees. It's a high-cost model for them. It's not scalable. They find it very difficult to find talent, especially for emerging technologies. And it does not also provide for opportunities to address the different learning styles of people. Some of them have moved on from having instructor-led training to adding on a service provider who could actually provide self-paced learning. And so this one service provider would try and provide content for everything that the organization would need: behavioral training, leadership training, training required for technology professionals. Anything that you could look at would be available with these kind of service providers. A few of them, the more mature ones and the thought leaders within the industry, are now going back to experimenting with marketplaces, and which we believe is there to stay for the future. So what these marketplaces offer for them is a wide choice for the employees to pick and choose not just content, but also the learning styles that they're most comfortable with, so that their learning effectiveness can be drastically increased. So these marketplaces are created by the organizations as a perspective of saying that they would transfer the onus of learning to the employee and ensure that the employee is provided with the widest choice, the best culture, and the best opportunities to learn so that they can then grow with the organization as the strategy evolves. So is self-paced learning really, something that's effective? So if you look at, our research, you'd probably tend to agree with us that self-paced learning is here to stay and is actually now creating more impact. So as we polled a lot of our own customers here in India, and we found out from them what is the impact that they were seeing, they came out with 4 large areas of feedback. They said, self-paced learning, especially with Pluralsight, is actually creating business impact. It's creating more time for work. Most people learn outside of office hours with self-paced learning, as compared to staying in classrooms during working hours with conventional models of training. It has great business impact because most people who came back and said that they were able to contribute back to their work real time. There was an effective and more quicker application of skills. So the sooner a technology was identified as a priority area for the organization and people went on to self-paced learning, the faster they were able to learn and apply it on the job. And most of them came back saying it was more effective than instructor-led training. So some statistics here, 90% of our users have come back and said that they have been able to learn new skills for current projects. Over 36% of them have said that they've learned skills not just for their current projects, but they've also learned skills for new projects as well, which means that they've been able to cross-skill themselves instead of just upskilling themselves. 55% of our users have come back and said that they were able to apply skills within 1 week of going through the learning, which is a tremendous impact that is being created for the organization in terms of a business, in terms of actually impacting the business. What are some of our customers saying? Here's what we heard from individual users, but what are some of our customers saying? 67% have demonstrated that or have shared that they've seen increased productivity. 39% of them have been able to retain employees better. We keep hearing all the time that the concern that organizations have is if they invest too much in skilling, there is a flight risk for employees, that employees could leave and join other organizations for better opportunities. There's always going to be a case of employees leaving and joining other organizations. It's a fact of the industry today, but not skilling them is not a solution to that problem. Now, here is the case where 39% of our customers have come back and said they've actually been able to retain people because people feel more valued when they've been invested into as far as learning and development is concerned. 34% of the people have actually been able to troubleshoot better. 32% of organizations have been able to reduce freelancers, which means they've been able to cut costs on learning. And 28% have actually been able to lower the cost of skilling altogether. So statistics here clearly point to the fact that moving away from conventional forms of learning, moving away from prescriptive forms of learning, and empowering people to learn on their own, at their own pace, has better returns for the organization. We also have to understand that learning today for the millennials is not going to be the same as what it was for people of our generation, as an example. Today's millennials want to learn on the go. Mobility is a very key aspect of their learning strategy. They do not like to sit in classrooms. Classrooms are too much of a confinement for them. They'd love to learn virtually, from wherever they are, from others. They'd love to learn in a competitive environment, in a gamified environment. Everything for them has to have an ability of excitement. And unless that excitement is provided, they're not interested in sitting and learning. And the last is, it's not just about learning from books. It's not about learning from websites. It's not about learning from digital content. It's also about learning from peers, because that social element is so strong for our millennials that unless the learning environment within your organization constitutes and enables all these 4 different facets of learning, your learning effectiveness for the millennials is going to be a lot reduced from what you think it would be. So, net, how is learning going to happen for the future? Today, learning, unfortunately, the onus is with the employer, because the employer feels that there is a need, and if the need is not addressed, it can impact business. Tomorrow, however, it's going to shift to the employee. And that's what we observed with organizations that are setting up marketplaces. There's no carrot and stick approach. It's a very simple approach to say that if the opportunity is provided, the employee needs to take advantage of that and prove the capabilities. The employee does not. The employee doesn't find a place within the organization, but those who do can grow rapidly within the organization. So this approach towards enabling employees to learn is probably going to constitute how the next 3 or 4 years of learning in the country is going to be determined. And that's really key. Most organizations today are getting ready to take advantage of this shift and are creating the environment and the platform and are providing the necessary aspects of learning that would excite the millennials so that the onus of learning can be translated to them. So before we wind up, what should the L&D function really focus on, therefore? So having heard what we have right now, in order to improve the learning effectiveness, the L&D function and the role of the CLO that Esther talked about should be more oriented towards creating a culture of learning. How does it become more real, and how does it become really engaging? The role of the CLO is also to see what is going to be the impact of the business that the learning operations are going to contribute to. It has to provide scale, it has to be timely, it has to be relevant, and it has to be of very high quality. It has to transition into something which is actually going to be more self-paced, and it has to have an ability to measure the impact through better assessment models. It has to take into account the new platforms that are going to excite the millennials of the future, whether it is social learning, whether it is mobile learning, or whether it is going to be gamified environments. And as a last strategy, what is going to be the strategy, or what is going to be the plan to create the learning environment and the content? Is that something that needs to be done in-house? Is that something that needs to be done with a single vendor, or is that going to be a free marketplace? All of these aspects that we just discussed over the last 15 to 20 minutes are areas that every single CLO in an organization needs to take into account before deciding the strategy for learning. So, last few slides to wind up. Wanted to, Esther and Ritu were kind enough to introduce Pluralsight, but just to take that a step further, we are a company that's been focused on technology learning. We are the largest technology, content provider globally. We are a 11-year-old organization with over 11,000 customers. And what makes us unique is the fact that we have a model by which we are able to attract the best subject matter experts who are professionals in their own right within the industry to come back and write content for us as business partners. So we have over 800 authors, where every author gets a royalty when his or her content is being consumed, and therefore that's the incentive for the author to keep the content most current and to write content of the highest quality. We are today over 5,000 courses strong. We are adding courses at about 80 a month, and which actually is going across several different verticals. There are 7 verticals that we focus on, and so this should address people from any industry who are on the call today, from software development to IT operations, data sciences, creative professionals, people who do everything from digital marketing to advertising to movie making, business content professionals, manufacturing and design, and architecture. So these are 7 different verticals that we focus on. We have over 12,850 hours of video content that's available, highly interactive. And not just that, our focus is to create, in addition to the best content, the best assessment services and the social and collaborative learning platform that can allow learners to learn from each other and learners to assess themselves constantly on their skills and get guidances on what best to learn from the vast library that we have. A quick snapshot of the 5,000 plus courses today. Over 1,200 courses that we have are digital centric. So ranging from the different aspects of digital that we talk about, SMAC, Internet of Things, automation, and also looking at everything from data sciences to infrastructure management, all of those covered with over 1,200 courses in digital. Our biggest spread of courses obviously exists in the software development and in the software development and in the IT operations side, and creative professionals being equivalent to about 1,600 courses that we have in our library. So for all of you on the call today, we'll be happy to extend a trial which would actually give you a view of how we look at the interface that we have. It's a very, very contemporary interface, and it's actually increasing the effectiveness of learning, as is seen from the data that's being shared by a lot of our learners. So that's really what I wanted to share today. I'd like to thank you for the time, and Esther, we'd like to open it up for questions if you're okay with that.
Great. Thanks so much, Arun. And I have actually been compiling the questions as you were taking us through the presentation, and we have lots of them. Even though we only have 10 minutes, we'll try to cover as much as we can. And for those questions that we're not able to cover, Arun, I may actually request you to cover them offline to make sure that we actually really fulfill all the expectations of our listeners this morning. So let me start with the first question. It's come from Vinisha. She is referring to the value proposition for leaders and how is that different from different industries. But I want to link that as well with another question from one of our listeners this morning about how do we really, again, the whole point about ROI, and how do we really build that business case for investment in learning, specifically when we're looking at bringing new technologies and so on and so forth. Arun, how do we build that business case, which is one of the big challenges, I think, for many of our listeners this morning? And you've seen that not only with many organizations you work, but also as a business leader yourself. So how does one create a business case for investment in learning?
No, that's a great point that was asked. So obviously, most organizations today are looking at creating, a business case, and they're looking at, I would say, metrics to look at how effective has the learning been. Now, the way we have looked at it is to say, what has been the direct impact of the business that people have been able to do? A, have you been able to reduce the cost of hiring? Have you been able to increase the time required for deployment? Have you been able to look at, increased productivity that people have been able to demonstrate at the work, which means getting more done at lesser time? And 4, has the outcomes that have been delivered to their clients been delivered in a shorter period of time? Now, if these 4 or 5 different areas have been addressed, obviously, there has been a return on investment to the learning agenda that has been driven by organizations. If we were to look at a more formal structure, then possibly we could look at a number of areas that could be used to create a business case. And these are metrics that most organizations could look at. A, can a formal feedback be taken from every learner who's been given access to self-paced learning to say how do they feel about the learning and what has been their reaction to the environment provided? And that's a good way of going back and saying that here is what learners are saying in self-paced learning versus conventional forms of learning. The second thing that we could do is look at the assessments pre and post learning to see if there's been a direct impact to the learning. So the way we advocate that is there are platforms that can be platform skills that can be assessed before a learner takes up a learning environment. Once the learner has gone through an engaging program for, let's say, 30 hours or 40 hours of learning, they can come back and take the assessment once again to see what scores they've got. The scores after have been better than the scores prior, then obviously there's been an impact to the learning that's been advocated, and that's a good form, a good way for organizations to build a business case. The third is, like I said, what behavioral change have employees been able to demonstrate on the job and at work? And has that been different? Which can be assessed from the managers, and if managers have been able to give a positive feedback on that, then I would tend to think that the business case has been made. So put together, I guess, these are some metrics that can be employed by the learning and development leads in a very simple way, which can go back to understanding or go back to evaluating if the case has been built within the organization.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Arun. So from the business case to the other part of the whole equation, which is the learner himself or herself. So there are 2 questions, one from Vandana and one from Pearl, which I'm going to join together, which is this whole piece about how do we engage the learner to actually participate in the learning. So you've told us how to build a business case for leaders. Now, how do we get the learner to participate?
A fantastic question. And I think this goes back into the culture of learning that we talked about initially and the role of the CLO in establishing the culture of learning. Today, learning, let's face it, today's organizations focus on learning which are prescriptive in nature. There are either, skill maps that are provided, so organizations can advocate and assess a person's skill competency, and then look at, providing some guidance around the courses that they should learn so they can move to the next level of competency. Now, obviously, this is something where people do what they're told. Not all of them align to that. So there is a challenge, obviously, that needs to be addressed. Now, on the other hand, in the free marketplace model and organizations that are now transferring the onus of learning to the employee, this is something where people go back and say that the field is wide open for them to learn what they want, in addition to some skills that need to be learned, which are basics of the job. But if they demonstrate increased capabilities and in skills that they were not expected to learn, then they have opportunities to grow within the organization. So that is actually now the trend that we observe in organizations that are leading, skill development and training, and that's providing opportunities for people to further their careers with an organization that is making it more engaging. The last part that I'd like to talk about here is, as part of establishing the culture of learning, this has to take into account the 4 key requirements to address the millennials' needs, which is mobility-based learning, social-based learning. It has to have an ability for people to learn, through a gamified environment, so they see a lot of excitement and a competitive nature of learning. So these are areas by which, and then of course the last one being virtual training, and not advocate people to be sitting in classrooms and being confined to that. So unless these 4 factors are built into the learning agenda, the learning aspects cannot be engaging. So these are things that any CLO will have to take into account as they strategize for their learning needs.
Wonderful. Thanks, Arun. So it was a small question from Anuradha, but I think I want to pick it up as well because it may be relevant for other listeners as well. How is content quality different from content relevance?
That's a great question. So let's say that, just as an example, today somebody needs to learn a course on, or somebody needs to gain knowledge on how do they transition, applications which are running in a data center to a cloud. People can search online and they can get to understand how cloud computing works. Now, obviously, that's not content that's relevant to the topic that the learner wants to learn. But if they find something which says, okay, would you like to understand how to migrate on-premise applications to Azure or to Amazon Web Services? Then the answer is that it's absolutely relevant content that the person would need to see. Now, the content quality is, once they get into the course, how comprehensive is it? And does that cover all aspects that the person wants to learn? Does it cover aspects of security? Does it cover aspects of business continuity? Does it cover aspects of security and user management? If let's say all of the topics that the user wants to learn is covered in that particular topic, once they found the relevance, then that's enhancing the content quality. So that's how content quality and content relevance would be different.
Great. Thank you so much, Arun. So we have time for, we actually run out of time. It's almost 12 on my watch, but I want to take one final question. And for everybody else who we've not been able to cover the questions, with Arun's consent, I will be sending those questions to you. And if you and your team can please revert back to the questions that we've not been able to answer. Arun, is that fine?
Our pleasure, Esther. That would be a delight for us. We'd absolutely do that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So last question for today, I think very genuine question from from Shelly, saying that for organizations who are probably smaller in size, as part of our listener group this morning, and we don't actually even have an L&D function per se, but we have the aspiration to probably ingrain learning culture and really create something sustainable as we grow. How do we get started? What's your advice, Arun, as we close this webinar today?
Right. Great. Thank you for that. My view has been that the smaller organizations actually have the ability to be more agile as compared to the larger organizations that have to take into account several factors which, border on policy. What we've seen with smaller organizations that have been successful is that the business leaders tend to take the ownership of learning of their employees and tend to look at going straight into self-paced learning. That's actually provided a greater opportunity for their employees to learn, and that's actually now been also well received by the organization, by the employees who've actually chosen to stay on within the organization because there's been opportunities provided for learning for them. So my advice is just pick, the topics that you're looking to drive learning or to look at skill development. If it's technology, our recommendation strongly would be that come to Pluralsight. We have the best content for you. And look at taking on, those courses. And instead of being very prescriptive, open up, learning as an opportunity for your employees. That would be the best way to take up learning and development for smaller organizations, in my view.
Great. So thank you so much. Thanks, Arun, and thanks all of you who have joined us for this webinar. As we close the webinar, I again remind you, make sure that all the questions will be answered by Arun and his team. I want to take the opportunity to thank Pluralsight for helping us put the content together, and specifically to you, Arun, for sparing time. I know how busy your schedule is. It's been a fantastic 1 hour together. So thank you so much, Arun.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call.
Wonderful. Thanks. So the presentation and the webinar recording will be available for all our listeners, and for everybody who probably missed the beginning or was dropped in the middle, and also for you to share with your peers, your colleagues, and take the learning forward. This concludes the webinar for this morning. Wish you all a very wonderful day, and see you very soon. Cheers.